it's become kind of a disaster right now with the number of people who've been injured and the shortage of the funding for those to add staff. So I don't think it was a deficiency as much as perhaps a lack of planning on our part when we passed that legislation as to how that was going to affect the facilities.
Senator Benson.
Mr. Chair, and to Senator Eaton's point, does that mean our fiscal notes aren't accurate? Because that's what you're saying. Because we passed the bill, there was a fiscal note with it. If MMB is not good at fiscal notes, then let's just call it out. Because if we need a deficiency bill for legislation that was passed, there was an emergency in health because there was an unforeseen avian flu epidemic. That was truly unforeseen. If MMB is bad at fiscal notes, then that's the situation you just described. So let's be very clear. And let's be clear, because we don't know how much this is going to cost. I sit on the Human Services Committee. I'd like to know what this is going to cost. Because if there's that much slush put in the budget that we passed, then there was a lot of misrepresentation going on at the Human Services table. We were told things were tight. There were specific things that were targeted. I don't know how many millions of dollars this impacts in human services, and if you can't tell me, that calls into question MMB's ability to structure a budget for human services. I don't recall seeing a call out that says potential growth in employee salaries. And as long as I'm calling you out on things, how much time did you spend talking to the House of Representatives about potential provisions that would result in a satisfactory outcome for the Republican-controlled House, Ms. Cordes? Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, Senator Benson, the authority to bargain is delegated to MMB under statute. We do receive ultimate authorization for whatever our ultimate settlements are from the governor. We don't have any specific or separate conversations with the legislature. We have, in fact, discussed that issue internally at MMB, and we're always open to input or other ideas on how we can engage in the process, and would be happy to review that moving forward.
And Mr. Chair and Ms. Cordes, because you didn't do that for this cycle, you make it very hard for the House to have any input that they can, as a caucus, say, you know what, I think we got some reasonable reforms. And I can't speak for the House. Not only am I not a member of the House, I'm in the minority in my body, but if we are aiming for success, early conversation is better than conflict. And it feels like we're being set up for conflict. The watchword around this Capitol in divided government is compromise. I would like to know what in this proposal you believe is a compromise position.
Representative Hillstrom, did you have a response to that?
Thank you, Mr.
Chair, I directed my question to Ms. Cordes. Did you want to just pass by that? Do you want me to withdraw my question? How would you like to?
I don't care what we do. Ms. Cordes, why don't you answer your question?
Mr. Chair, Senator Benson, yes, this proposal does represent a compromise. Under statute, we are required to enter into collective bargaining with our exclusive representatives every 2 years. It's a complicated, extensive process. We typically start with 50 to 60 issues on the table. We do want to achieve voluntary settlements. It's extremely important. We do believe that the 2.5% across the board increases that are included as part of these tentative agreements are important. They're important in terms of our ability to be able to recruit a qualified workforce to the state, and there are certainly costs associated with not being able to do that. So we thought it was important for our competitiveness moving forward as well.
Senator Benson.
Mr. Chair, I'm fine with hiring people based on talent in a competitive environment. I know we're having trouble retaining auditors of the Department of Revenue. I know Minute is a highly competitive field, but I don't see specific call-outs. I know there are some provisions for commissioners to give extra incentives, but if we really want to talk about a competitive workforce, spreading the benefits like peanut butter is not an effective way to remain competitive in a workforce. And when I look at, for example, the ratio of payment for health benefits compared to what's going on in the private sector, the ratio is much lower on the negotiated contract side than it is in the private sector. And so I think if we looked at total compensation, including the net present value of pensions, the contributions to health care, I think this committee would have a better view of what we actually look like as an employer and how competitive we actually are. But we get this piecemeal, hidden, veiled. We only get one vote, up or down. That's all we get. We don't get to say, where are we having trouble hiring? And what do they really need? Because no conversation ever comes here and says, you know what, we've got this many open positions at Minute. This is what the private market salary is, and this is what we need. Nobody ever brings us that information. We get 2.5%, everybody, no matter what. It's very hard for us to be good employers when we only get an up or down and across the board. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Now, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Benson, I also wanted to respond to your question about compromise. So the department is supposed to compromise with the employees' representatives. The House and the Senate are supposed to compromise with each other. There is nothing keeping us in the House or the Senate from putting in a bill to say this area of the government is more important to us and we would like to have an additional pot of money for additional salary or differences in employees. And there's nothing keeping us from putting in a bill to say that we think that we should add an additional benefit. But we are not supposed to interfere with the negotiations of the labor contracts. We do get an up or down vote. We get to accept them or we get to reject them, and that's the way it should be. Because I've been here when this legislature attempted to interfere in a labor contract and actually passed a statute changing a negotiated contract. That's not the way it's supposed to work. That's not the way the statute is designed. So I'm happy to work with you if you think there's an area that we need to add additional resources to make sure that we have adequate employees that can do additional work because they are more important. I'm happy to work with you in those areas, but it is not this group's job to micromanage and interfere in the negotiated agreements. We get an up or down vote. We either pass them or we don't. And if we don't, they go back to the negotiations table and they'll negotiate something else. It is our job to decide whether or not this is a good enough deal for the state based on the negotiated agreements, and that's the way it should stay.
Representative Gunhagen.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to make it short because time's flying by here. But, you know, one of the reasons this is a little bit important, I think, or is important, is I've got this summary sheet of all the increases, and Minsky explained. But it comes to $497,262, and it doesn't include the merit steps, which add probably another 60 to 90 million or more to the total settlement. So we're talking about over $500 million. And what I would suggest, and just as a suggestion, is that at settlement time, each one of these units presents a short summary of how they expect to meet these increases, and if we have a downturn in the economy, what are their options? And again, it's just basic information that would be helpful in assessing their ability to meet these. Again, we're talking about over $500 million increase, and you know that's not small change to most people.